Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Criminal justice seems always to be in the news. So what's the latest? How are we doing in our fight against crime on the one hand and our efforts to curb criminal justice abuses on the other? We'll try and sort it out with my guest, Ron Kuby, a civil rights and civil liberties lawyer who was once a protégé of William Kunstler and who has spent decades defending the rights of the accused, the poor, and the downtrodden. Ron, thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with your latest case, which is fascinating. We had a fella who was convicted of one of the most high-profile crimes in New York back in 1990. He became your client, and you recently had his conviction overturned. Tell us about that case.
Well, his name is Johnny Hincapié, and he was one of the people arrested on September 1st, 1990, in the case that ultimately caused David Dinkins to lose his mayoralty, the Brian Watkins case. The Watkins family had come here from Utah to see the U.S. Open. They'd gone down a subway, sort of elbowed their way through a group of Latino youth that were all hanging out waiting to see a concert at the Roseland Ballroom. They went down to the subway platform, and what started out as a robbery ended up as a murder of young Brian Watkins, stabbed to death by a gang of young people. It was the case that gave us the headline in the New York Post, "Dave, do something."
Right.
It was really the case that changed New York. They rounded up 8 young people, ultimately. One of them they realized was innocent after he spent 18 months in Rikers Island, and then they let him loose, absolutely terrorized. And he left the country, went back to Colombia, never wanted to come back to the United States again. They put 7 on trial, 7 were convicted, including Johnny Hincapié, my client.
Who was how old at the time?
He was 17 at the time.
Okay.
And he had always, and no criminal record, no criminal history, came from a nice family, solid immigrant's dream family. And he had always maintained that he was not guilty, and maintained that for a very long time. Ultimately, after he spent 20 years in prison, a journalist who in fact now teaches at CUNY School of Journalism, a guy named William Hughes, thought he would take a look back at that case, because it was the case that changed New York. That was the title of his article. And he began to investigate the case and discovered that the guy who had fled the country had come back, talked to that guy and said, look, Johnny wasn't there. Johnny was hanging out with me. Continued to investigate the case and came up with a lot of evidence that Hincapié did not commit this crime. So after a year and a half of brutal litigation in front of the Manhattan DA's office, because they were adamant about this, as they're adamant about everything, we finally secured a ruling. The conviction was overturned based on newly discovered evidence.
But one of the things that has happened in so many of these cases is that Hincapié actually confessed to the crime, even though he didn't commit the crime. One, why did he do it in this particular case? And then why does this happen so often?
You know, it's funny because most people think, most people say to themselves, I don't care what happened to me.
I would never, not if I didn't do it.
Confess, and you'd have to like beat me bloody, and I sign my name in blood. We know from objective data of people who have been exonerated that some 20% of people who have actually been exonerated didn't do it. Somebody else did it. Made confessions, gave confessions.
Yep.
Johnny was a young guy. There was tremendous police pressure to solve the case. They knocked him around. They scared him. And he ultimately gave a confession, much of which was fed to him by the police. It was funny looking back on it because we had a detective on the stand who had been who had been a detective for 30 years, from 1968 through 1998. And he got up there and he said, in those 30 years of policing, the only thing he had ever seen any officer ever do to get a confession from a suspect was raise his voice.
Oh my goodness.
Nothing more serious than that ever. 30 years of policing during the toughest times in New York. Obviously a lie.
Right. So we've seen, though, over the decades, a tremendous amount of abuses in the criminal justice system. I remember when we were writing articles, you always had to say, well, not all police officers are corrupt, or not all police officers are violent, which of course is true. They're not, but there is quite a bit of corruption in the criminal justice system. So we've seen issues with the police in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also there are issues of prosecutorial and judicial misconduct. Can you talk about it a little bit and explain, if you can, how these abuses manifest themselves and why they continue?
Well, they continue. That's the easy part. They continue because there's enough people in society that want them to continue. We can look back on the so-called war on drugs as really a war that was waged primarily against inner city youth of color. I mean, I think we recognize that now.
Right.
We recognize that the 100-to-1 crack powder cocaine disparity was a war against young black drug addicts. To illustrate what that means, if you had an ounce of crack, you receive the same punishment that you would receive if you had 6 pounds of powder cocaine.
Which is insane, and the media completely fell down on covering that story and explaining to the public what was going on. But go ahead.
And if we, and I think that the idea was that, at least in white society, if we could just put enough black people in prison, the problem of crime would be solved.
Right.
So whenever you have a system that's fundamentally unjust, it's because people, who have the power want to maintain that system. I mean, happily, we're beginning to change ever so slightly. There's a movement now, both liberal and conservative, against mass incarceration. There's a movement to decarcerate increasing numbers of people. There's a recognition that it's costly in terms of money, and it's mind-bogglingly costly in terms of lives destroyed, not just of the defendants, but of their families and of the community fabric generally.
I remember the days, I guess it was back in the 1980s when it started with the crack cocaine so-called epidemic emerged. Actually, it was an epidemic. But there were all these horror stories about crack babies, and these kids were the most violent folks that you've ever seen. And it was nonsense. It was just not true. This was a form of cocaine. So we're beginning to change now, but you still see, with the stop and frisk issue, or in the data that we see when it comes to traffic stops and that sort of thing, that blacks are stopped so much more frequently than whites. But when you look at the arrest data, or when you look at things that are guns or other contraband that's confiscated, consistently it happens more often with whites than with blacks. So why are blacks continuing to be stopped more often?
It's an interesting data point that you mentioned, because in fact, the studies showed that when cops engaged in stop and frisk, they were twice as likely to find criminality when they stopped and frisked a white person as they were when they stopped and frisked a person of color. So people should have said, this is easy. Let's stop and frisk more white people, because we're really good at spotting criminality among white people. Let's focus on that. The stop and frisk issue was really a form of Ray Kelly and Bloomberg policing throughout the 12 years of Bloomberg's mayoralty. The idea was that you could get guns off the street if you simply stopped enough people. And that's true. I mean, the more people you stop, the more guns you're going to get. Period.
If you stopped everyone.
Right. But the destruction of community trust, the relationships between the oppressed community and the police force, and even the cops didn't like doing these stop and frisks. If you talk to the regular cops on the street, it's like, I don't want to do this. I have to get the numbers up. All I'm doing is angering people who are not criminals, who I shouldn't anger, alienating often their parents, who should be my allies, in a form of community policing. But this is the sort of heavy hand that Bloomberg and Ray Kelly wanted for the city during that time.
But you have not just done criminal law. I mean, you've done civil rights law, and you've done civil liberties and other types of cases as well. How do you pick your clients?
Well, It becomes very difficult because I have a very small office and the demand is much greater than the supply of me. So I try to, these days, I'm looking for cases where I think people who have been wrongfully convicted, that is, they're actually innocent of the crime
right.
for which they were convicted. When I started doing that work, I wondered, I spent all this time getting guilty people off. How much harder could it be to get innocent people out? Turned out it's a lot harder to get innocent people out than it is to get guilty people off. So I look for cases people who are actually innocent. And I look for cases where there's a larger principle at stake beyond simply the rights of this individual.
How are we doing in that area? Because it would seem that you're the lawyer and I'm not, but it would seem to me that the way the law has been interpreted in recent decades makes it more difficult to free people who are innocent, even when you, in many cases, know that they're innocent.
Well, the good news is that has begun to change. In the state of New York, in January of 2014, one of the appeals courts held for the first time that a claim of innocence can be what we call a freestanding claim that you can bring to court. Now, most people are shocked to learn, wait a second.
Right.
I would think that would be the claim you would make, but no, there are all kinds of procedural barriers. You have to claim constitutional violation. The fact that you have discovered evidence of innocence, or you were innocent all along, seldom mattered to the system. That's beginning to change. The Innocence Project and folks like that are beginning to have raised consciousness about how many wrongful convictions there are. And many prosecutors are willing to take a second look at cases, most notably Ken Thompson in the Brooklyn DA's office, who really ran for election on that platform, and unlike most people, carried out his promises. Contrast him with Manhattan DA Cy Vance, who also talked about wrongful convictions, but I think at this point has like one person reviewing cases.
I covered that Brooklyn DA's office when I was at the Times, and the number of people who were innocent, who were sent to prison for horrendous crimes, was actually horrifying. I mean, really horrifying. We talked a little bit about false confessions. Another thing that's kind of counterintuitive is how unreliable eyewitness identifications are in criminal cases. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. There are, again, science is a really good thing. Studies are a really good thing, and there have been hundreds of well-controlled studies that have reenacted eyewitness identification scenarios, and they uniformly find that the most difficult form of identification to get right, cross-racial identification of strangers made under conditions of high stress. And this is true of...
And if you're the victim of a crime,
that's
stress.
Exactly right. The guy's pointing a gun at you, and under those circumstances, pretty much, y'all do look alike. And what happens in those kinds of cases is you're taken to a lineup, standard television lineup, and too often the police, usually unconsciously, coach you as to the person to pick. You say, I think it's number 3, and they say, well, okay, why don't you have another look? Take a good look at number 2. Oh yeah, so you already know, 3 is wrong, 2 is right, you go with number 2, and then you get to see him over and over again, and by the time you testify...
You do recognize
you totally do, because you've seen him like 5 times in photos, in the lineup, at pretrial hearings, and now at trial, and you get there and say, that's him, I'll never forget his face as long as I live.
Right. And then folks are convicted on that basis. And a jury, I would imagine, would tend to say, well, eyewitness identification, that's pretty strong stuff. The victim says he's the one who did it.
It's the least reliable, and yet in terms of trying a case, the most impressive to a jury, which is why criminal justice advocates, reform advocates, continue to argue for what we call double-blind lineups. That is, the officers who are actually conducting the lineups, who are there with the witness in the room behind the one-way glass that we've all seen on television, those cops don't know who the subject is.
So you don't have the arresting officer sitting there who might be able to coach the witness. You have some other officer who does not know who the alleged criminal is.
That's exactly right. And that way, the officer cannot consciously, or more often unconsciously, cue the witness as to who the correct person is.
Right. So we talked about stops. Sometimes stops on the street. Sometimes you're pulled over in a vehicle. If you were talking to young people, let's say in New York City, but almost anywhere, how are they supposed to behave if they're stopped by the police, and what are they obliged to do? For example, if you're on the street or if you're a passenger in a vehicle, do you have to have identification?
There's no requirement that you carry identification in the United States of America. You can walk down the street without ID. You're not required to carry it. But look, it's a good idea. We live in a post 9/11 world. It's a good idea to bring your identification with you, just like it's a good idea to bring your house keys with you, even if you think somebody is going to be at home when you come back. And what I tell young people, because I'm mostly concerned really with their safety, not their lawsuit,
right,
is when you're in a police confrontation, the police are confronting you, comply with their commands. If they say stop, you stop. If they say hands up, then it's hands up. You can litigate this at a later time, but you're not going to win that argument on a street corner in the dark with a couple of police officers.
And what if those officers want to search you?
Well, if they have the right to search you, they will not ask your permission. They'll just stop you and frisk you and search you. If they ask you, if they ever ask, may I search your car?
Right.
Then the correct answer is no. I mean, unless you really just don't have anything in your car and you just want to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. But since you never know who was actually in your car and may have left something, the correct answer is no.
Right.
If the police are asking for something, that means they can't force you to do it.
Right.
When they're doing it to you, they don't ask.
How'd you get in this racket? How did you, very seriously, how did you come to choose law as a career?
Well, the truth is that I was an aspiring anthropologist.
Look out.
That's right, at a great Midwestern university. And I had applied for a very prestigious fellowship, which I did not get. And I confronted the head of the board in the street one day as to why I didn't even get recommended by the university. And they said it was because of my attitude, which they characterized as condescending and arrogant. And I went to the bar.
I can't imagine that something like that came up in your case,
right.
But go ahead.
I was young. And I went to the bar where I was working, and the bartender said, you ought to try law school. They like people like that. And that was actually the first time that I thought about a legal career. I had always been interested in social justice, but that was the first time I really thought about doing it for a living.
And you came, I mentioned William Kunstler. And those of us of a certain age are aware of him and in many cases admire him tremendously. For those who don't know, tell us who William Kunstler was and how you came to be hooked up with him.
William Kunstler was the greatest civil rights and criminal defense lawyer of the last half of the 20th century. He took on all the unpopular cases, all the unpopular causes. He went from being a special counsel to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To representing various radicals in the American Indian movement, to representing other oppressed youth. And he always hated abuse of power, always hated racism, and fought his life fighting racism. He and I took up a case that was very unpopular at the time called the Central Park Jogger case. And were uniformly criticized throughout, not just the conservative white community, but the liberal white community. Actually, a lot of the black community too was very.
Another case that was a media sensation.
Huge sensation. Yeah. Another case where they all confessed. Another case where all the confessions were false. Another case where there was vindication. Although sadly, Bill Kunstler had died before the Central Park Five were vindicated. I came to him as a young, eager law student in 1982. I just kept writing to him and writing to him.
Where was that?
I was in Cornell University, Cornell Law School, and he was in New York. And I kept sending him letters and resumes. And I ultimately found all that stuff in his office when I got down there. It had been unopened and was used to wedge an air conditioner so it was flush with the windowsill. But eventually I called people who knew him and I was willing to work for free. It was just too much of a hassle to keep ignoring me. So he said yes, and that was the beginning of the most wonderful time in my life as a young lawyer.
So he was famous, and I knew of him through the press and through media, but what was he really like?
He was, one of the few authentic geniuses that I've ever met. He was a man who very much wanted to live every day of his life, every phase of history as fully as possible. He was an author, he was a cab driver, he was a major in World War II, he was a teacher, a civil rights lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, and always was wanting to feel the fabric of the times in which he lived, and was passionately committed to the idea that you have to make your life mean something. You have to leave the world a better place than when you found it.
So this was a period in the United States, and it's almost difficult to understand from this perspective, but the folks that you represented were really outcasts in the society. In those days, if you were, a so-called hippie, or if you were what people considered to be radicals, anti-war radicals, for example, or black protesters who were more militant, say, than Martin Luther King, you were really considered outcasts in those days. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like? There was the riot at the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968. Talk about what it was like in those days.
Well, unfortunately, I'm younger than I look. So as much as I would like to talk about Chicago, I have to talk about it through the prism of history because I was still a kid.
But didn't Kunstler talk about it?
Kunstler talked about it all the time. And Kunstler talked about what it was like in those days to go down south during the civil rights era and confront not, nasty comments, but the threat, the very reality of physical violence, to confront the Klan, to face a government that was engaged in massive law breaking when it came to anti-war demonstrators and people who were criticizing the status quo in America. And Bill always made himself the advocate and the protector of these very idealistic young people, who were determined to end the war in Vietnam, end poverty, stop racism, and okay, they all fell a bit short, but they tried.
So you're not just a lawyer, you're also a media personality. You have a daily radio program. Talk about the program.
The radio shtick began in 1996. I was doing an interview with Curtis Sliwa, the Guardian Angels. He's the guy that runs around.
Talk about the odd couple.
Right, exactly.
Sliwa.
He runs around looking like a giant thumb with a red condom on it, the red beret and the red sateen jacket. I was doing an interview with him in 1996 on air. It was about the Bernie Goetz case. In fact, I was suing Bernard Goetz at the time. He was the subway gunman who shot 4
You were suing
people.
Goetz for what?
Money. But mostly
on behalf of the people that he shot.
On behalf of the most seriously wounded, the young man, Darrell Caby, who was shot in the back.
Yeah.
And it was largely an attempt to demystify this guy, that he was not some sort of Charles Bronson figure, but in fact was a cowardly, racist, crazy man running around with a gun. And I think we were successful in doing that. But I did that interview. The program director at the time heard that show, said, gosh, if this guy Kuby can talk about other things in the way he's talking about this case, we may have a show. We continued, the show sort of grew. And these days it pays for my expenses, so I don't have to charge clients. I'd like to charge clients. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not against making money.
A lot of your clients don't have a lot of money.
I know. I've yet to figure out a way to monetize poor people. I know that others have succeeded in this, but I never have. So it pays for my law practice, and for that I'm very thankful.
So we've run out of time, but I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful that you came in to talk with us today. I really appreciate it. Ron Kuby.
Thank you. You've always been a journalistic hero of mine for many, many years. I'm proud to be invited by you.
Thanks so much. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. The United States is falling apart, literally. Recently, the outdoor parking lot at an International House of Pancakes in Mississippi collapsed. It just gave way, creating an enormous hole in the ground that swallowed more than a dozen vehicles. Luckily, no one was hurt. That was not the case in South Carolina, where 36 aging, decaying dams gave way during a heavy rain. 19 people were killed in the tremendous flooding that followed. We have a problem. According to the federal government, some 14,000 highway deaths each year, an incredible number, are linked to the sorry state of America's roads, bridges, and tunnels. We've known for a long time that America's physical infrastructure is in desperate need of upgrading and repair. It's not just roads and bridges and dams, it's our electrical grid and water systems, our natural gas pipelines, and on and on. Bringing this vast system up to date would not only save lives and untold billions of dollars, it would be an astonishing source of new, well-paying jobs. That we as a society can't seem to muster the will to meet this enormous challenge is unconscionable, not to mention embarrassing. That's all for now. See you next time.